There is a basement in the city of Yekaterinburg, Russia. It is not a large room. It is not a grand room. It is small, low-ceilinged, poorly lit, the kind of room that history should never have noticed. But on the night of July 16th, 1918, something happened in that basement that shocked the world, changed the course of history, and left behind a mystery that took the world nearly 100 years to fully understand. In that room, the most powerful royal family in the history of the world was erased from the earth in a single night. A family that had ruled 1/6 of the entire surface of the planet. A family that owned more gold, more land, more palaces, and more power than any other family in human history. Gone in one night, in one small basement, in one act of violence so sudden and so complete that the world struggled to believe it had actually happened. This is the story of the Romanovs, the story of how they rose, how they lived, how they fell, and the mystery that surrounded their end for nearly a century. A mystery that, even today, has not been entirely resolved. To understand the Romanovs, you need to understand Russia, not the Russia of today, the Russia of 300 years ago, a country so vast it defied comprehension, 11 time zones, hundreds of languages, millions of square miles of forest, steppe, mountain, and ice, a country so large that the sun rose over its eastern borders while it was still setting over its western ones. And over this impossible empire, one family ruled, the House of Romanov. They came to power in 1613 when a 16-year-old boy named Michael Romanov was chosen as Tsar of all Russia. It was a choice born of desperation. Russia had been torn apart by years of civil war and foreign invasion. The country needed a leader, a symbol, a name that could unite a fractured nation. Michael Romanov was young and relatively unthreatening. The boyars, the powerful nobles who controlled Russia's political machinery, believed he would be easy to manage. Once again, as with Hoover, the men who believed they were placing a puppet on the throne were profoundly mistaken. The Romanovs did not just rule Russia. They became Russia. For 304 years, through wars and famines and revolutions and reforms, the Romanov family sat on the Russian throne. They built St. Petersburg from nothing, turning a swamp on the Baltic Sea into one of the most beautiful cities in the world. They expanded Russian territory until it stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the borders of China and Persia. They produced some of history's most extraordinary rulers. Peter the Great, who dragged Russia into the modern world through sheer force of will. Catherine the Great, who turned Russia into a cultural and military power that rivaled anything in Europe. And they accumulated wealth on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. The wealth of the Romanovs was not simply a matter of money. It was a matter of scale that placed them in a category entirely their own. At the height of their power, the Romanov family directly owned approximately 1/3 of all the land in Russia. 1/3 of a country that covered 1/6 of the surface of the earth. They owned palaces, hundreds of palaces. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg alone contained 1,157 rooms, 1,945 windows, and 117 staircases. Their personal jewelry collection was beyond valuation. The Fabergé eggs, the famous jeweled masterpieces created exclusively for the Romanov family, were only a small fraction of what they possessed. They had crowns encrusted with diamonds the size of a man's thumb, necklaces that contained emeralds from the mines of the Ural Mountains, rooms in their palaces where the walls were lined with amber and gold. And beneath all of this visible wealth, there was something else, something that historians and treasure hunters have spent a century searching for: the Romanov gold. Hundreds of tons of imperial gold reserves, jewels and art and treasures that were hidden, moved, buried, and scattered in the chaos of revolution. Some of it has been found, much of it has not, and its location remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. But wealth on that scale does not protect you from history, and by the early 20th century, history was coming for the Romanovs. The man sitting on the Russian throne in 1900 was Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas was, by almost every account, a good man, a devoted husband, a loving father, a man of genuine personal kindness and warmth. He was also, by almost every account, profoundly unsuited to the role history had placed him in. He was not a natural ruler. He was not a strategic thinker. He was not someone who understood the forces that were reshaping the world around him. He had been raised to believe that his authority came from God, that the relationship between the Tsar and the Russian people was sacred and unbreakable, that the wave of democratic and revolutionary ideas sweeping through Europe would somehow pass Russia by. He was wrong about all of it. Russia in 1900 was a country on the edge of a breaking point. The vast majority of its population lived in conditions of poverty that had barely changed in centuries. Peasants worked land they did not own for landlords who did not know their names. Industrial workers in the growing cities labored for 16 hours a day in conditions that would have been considered inhumane, even by the standards of the time. And the gap between the world of the Romanovs, with their 1,000-room palaces and their walls of amber and gold, and the world of the Russian people, was so vast that it had become impossible to ignore. In 1905, the tension exploded. Workers marched peacefully to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar. They were not marching in anger. They were marching in hope. They believed, with a faith that is almost heartbreaking in retrospect, that if the Tsar only knew how they suffered, he would help them. The imperial guards opened fire. Hundreds were killed. The day became known as Bloody Sunday, and something broke in Russia that day that could never be repaired. Nicholas survived 1905. He made concessions. He created a parliament. He promised reforms. But the reforms were incomplete. The parliament was weak, and the concessions satisfied no one. And then came 1914, the First World War. Russia entered the war with an army of millions and a military infrastructure that was decades behind its enemies. The casualties were catastrophic. By 1916, Russia had lost more men than any other nation in the war. Soldiers were dying without boots on their feet and without rifles in their hands. Food was running short in the cities. The economy was collapsing. And Nicholas, in a decision that many historians consider his greatest mistake, had personally taken command of the Russian army, which meant that every military defeat was now personally associated with the Tsar. Every dead soldier was his responsibility. Every failed offensive bore his name. And in the palaces of St. Petersburg, as the empire crumbled, the Romanov family retreated further and further from reality. There was one more factor, one more element in the story of the Romanov collapse that cannot be ignored. His name was Grigory Rasputin. a peasant mystic from Siberia who had gained extraordinary influence over the royal family through his apparent ability to treat the illness of the Tsarevich. The young heir to the throne, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a condition in which the blood does not clot properly. In the early 20th century, this was essentially a death sentence. Any cut, any bruise, any minor injury could trigger uncontrolled bleeding. The Tsarina Alexandra watched her son suffer and became desperate for anyone who could help him. Rasputin appeared to help. How he did it is still debated by historians. But the result was that Alexandra trusted him completely, and Rasputin, sensing the access that trust gave him, used it. He inserted himself into political decisions. He advised on ministerial appointments. He whispered in the ear of the Tsarina while the Tsar was away at the front. To the Russian nobility, watching from the outside, it was incomprehensible. The most powerful throne in the world appeared to be under the influence of an unwashed Siberian peasant with wild eyes and a talent for manipulation. Rasputin was murdered in December 1916 by a group of nobles who believed they were saving Russia. It was too late. The damage was done, and the revolution was already coming. It came in February 1917, not with a dramatic declaration or a single decisive moment, but with bread, or rather, with the absence of it. Workers in Petrograd, the city formerly known as St. Petersburg, went on strike over food shortages. The strike spread. The protests grew. The soldiers sent to suppress them refused to fire, and within days, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty simply collapsed. Nicholas abdicated on March 2, 1917. He signed away the throne in a railway carriage, alone, without ceremony, without the farewell that 3 centuries of imperial rule might have been expected to command. He was not angry. He was not defiant. By most accounts, he was almost relieved. He had never wanted to be Tsar. He had once written in his diary, upon learning that his father had died and that he would now rule Russia, that he did not know how he would manage, that he was not ready. He had been right. And now, 23 years after writing those words, it was over. The family was placed under house arrest. First in the Alexandra Palace outside Petrograd, then, as the political situation deteriorated and a more radical government took power, they were moved further and further east, away from the capital, away from potential rescuers, away from the world, until they arrived in Yekaterinburg, in a house that a local merchant had built for his family, a house that the Bolsheviks had renamed. They called it the House of Special Purpose. The family arrived in Yekaterinburg in April 1918. Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, 22 years old, Tatiana, 21, Maria, 19, Anastasia, 17, and Alexei, 13 years old, still suffering from hemophilia, still the heir to a throne that no longer existed. They were not treated cruelly by the standards of what was to come. They had rooms, they had food, they had each other. Nicholas wrote in his diary every day. He exercised in the small yard of the house. He read. He played with his children. He seemed, to those around him, to have found a kind of peace in the simplicity of captivity that he had never found in the complexity of ruling an empire. But outside the walls of the house, the world was moving in a direction that would make the family's survival increasingly unlikely. A civil war was tearing Russia apart. The White Army, fighting to restore the old order, was advancing toward Yekaterinburg. The Bolshevik leadership in Moscow faced a decision. If the White Army reached Yekaterinburg and rescued the royal family, Nicholas could become a symbol, a rallying point for everyone who opposed the revolution, a living reminder of the old Russia. That could not be allowed. The order came from Moscow. The exact details of who gave it and in what form have been debated by historians ever since. But the result was not debated. On the night of July 16, 1918, the family was woken in the middle of the night. They were told to dress and come downstairs. They were told they were being moved for their own safety, that the White Army was approaching and they needed to relocate. Nicholas carried his son Alexei, who was too weak to walk, down the stairs. The family gathered in the basement room. They waited. A local photographer had been summoned, they were told. A photograph was needed for official purposes. They arranged themselves, as families do, for photographs. Nicholas stood in the center. Alexandra sat beside him. The children gathered around them, and then the men with guns walked into the room. What happened next lasted approximately 20 minutes. It was chaotic. It was brutal. It was far less swift and clinical than the official account suggested. The executioners fired. The room filled with smoke. The sounds were terrible. When it was over, 11 people were dead. Nicholas, Alexandra, all 5 children, the family doctor who had stayed with them, 3 servants who had refused to leave, 11 people who had walked into that basement expecting a photograph. They were carried out in the early hours of the morning and taken into the forest outside the city. The Bolsheviks needed them to disappear completely. A body could become a shrine. A martyr's grave could become a symbol. The remains had to vanish, and for decades they did. The Soviet government acknowledged that Nicholas had been executed, but the fate of the rest of the family was deliberately obscured. For 70 years, the question of what had truly happened in that basement remained officially unanswered, and into that silence, one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century was born. The mystery of Anastasia, the youngest daughter, the 17-year-old girl who, according to rumors that spread almost immediately after the executions, had somehow survived. The stories were specific. They were detailed. They came from multiple sources. Anastasia had been protected by the jewels sewn into her corset. She had been pulled from the chaos by a sympathetic guard. She had escaped into the night and made her way west. Over the decades, several women came forward claiming to be Anastasia. The most famous was a woman known as Anna Anderson, who spent decades insisting she was the surviving Romanov princess. She went to her grave maintaining that claim. Courts in multiple countries examined her story. Some believed her, some did not. And the world watched, fascinated, because the alternative, that a 17-year-old girl had been murdered in a basement in Siberia, was simply too terrible to accept without question. The mystery lasted until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian government finally allowed investigators access to the burial site. The remains were found in a shallow grave in the forest outside Yekaterinburg, buried hastily, covered with acid to obscure identification. DNA testing confirmed the identities. Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of the 5 children, but not all 5. 2 sets of remains were missing: Alexei and one of the daughters. The missing remains were found in 2007, buried separately, a short distance from the main grave. DNA testing confirmed that they belonged to Alexei and to Maria, not Anastasia, and DNA testing performed on samples from Anna Anderson confirmed that she was not who she claimed to be. She had no Romanov blood. Anastasia had died in that basement with her family. The mystery was solved. After nearly a century of wondering, of hoping, of imagining a different ending to a terrible story, the answer was the one that history had been trying to tell us all along. There was no escape. There was no surviving daughter. There was only a basement in Yekaterinburg and a family that had ruled the world. Gone in a single night. Here's what we know. The Romanovs ruled Russia for 304 years. They built one of the greatest empires in human history. They accumulated wealth beyond imagination. And they were brought down not by foreign invasion, not by military defeat, not by any single catastrophic failure, but by their inability to understand the world that was changing around them. Nicholas II was not a monster. He was a man who loved his family deeply and ruled his country poorly. A man who believed that God had chosen him to lead and never questioned whether God might have made a mistake. And his inability to question that belief cost him everything: his throne, his freedom, his life, and the lives of his children, 5 young people who had no say in the family they were born into, who had no choice about the world they were brought into, who died in a basement in Siberia because of decisions made by men they had never met. The last Tsar of Russia is buried today in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the city his ancestor built, the city that was once the center of the most powerful empire on earth. He was given a state funeral in 1998, 80 years after his death, in the same city where his dynasty had once seemed eternal. The Russian Orthodox Church declared him a saint, a man whose greatest sin was not cruelty or corruption or malice, but a failure of vision, an inability to see what was coming until it was already in the room. Think about the 5 children who walked into that basement, who dressed in the middle of the night because their father told them to, who arranged themselves for a photograph that was never taken. History is not always made by the powerful. Sometimes it is made by the powerless, by the ones who had no choice, by the ones who simply trusted that the adults around them knew what they were doing. The Romanovs had everything the world could offer: palaces and gold and power and legacy, and in the end, none of it mattered, because none of it could protect them from the moment history decided it was time to move on. If this story stayed with you, if it changed something in the way you see power and wealth and the illusion of permanence, subscribe, because the stories of the families who believed they would last forever and did not are far more numerous than the history books have told you. And I am just getting started.